Okay, now we're going to talk about duality. What we experience is dual and opposite in nature. Each part of the pair of opposites must exist for the other part to exist. One gives being to the other. We cannot experience one without experiencing the other. If we don't know sadness, we cannot experience happiness. If we were happy all the time, we wouldn't even know we were happy. Nothing exists without its opposite.
Yeah, like if you're healthy, you don't know you're healthy till you're around sick people. You love, for instance, people want to be loved, so they experience the opposite of that to experience love. So you don't get one without the other. People that want to have everything one way, they're really disappointed because the opposite is always there. You don't get one without the other. Like birth and death. I mean, everybody wants to be alive, but this is a dual and opposite situation we're in. You're born and then you're born to die. You don't get one without the other. When we go to make something happen, we're going to be trying to make this happen, and what's happening at the same time is the opposite of that. Mm-hmm. So if I'm pushing down on the table, I'm getting a force that's equal and opposite to that applied to me to balance whatever I'm up to here. So, if you have a government that wants to make something happen, then you got to understand that you're not only just pushing this way, you're also going to be receiving the opposite of that.
Resistance.
The opposite. If your intention is to, the well-being of the people, and you come up with X, Y, and Z programs so that the people will be well, at the same time you're pushing in this direction, you're going to find out those programs create unwellness. Just as much as you're trying to do this, that's actually what's happening. So there's no way out of it. You push this way, you get the opposite of it. Now, big corporations think they can, big government, whatever, they think they have unlimited resources and they can make anything happen. But the way it works is if you push harder on this table will break. Mm-hmm. And then whatever force I'm increasingly putting on this to make something happen will then be supported by that floor. But the more I push and push and push and want it to make it happen, I've not only destroyed the table, but eventually that floor is going to go. And then I'm going to be in a situation where I'm pushing on the ground. You understand? And at some point I realized that I'd run out of energy, time, and money and everything else trying to get something to happen the way I want to make it happen. And ultimately, I'm balanced. Everything that I did really is ultimately balanced. If you take a look at Hitler, for instance, when he had this idea of the Aryan, non-Aryan race, as the opposites that he looked through. And that determined pretty much his world, the world that he thought was the appropriate world to be in, based on this distinction, And he put a lot of force, on that principle, that the non-Aryans need to be eliminated or subjugated. And the Aryans should be supreme. And he kept pushing on that, pushing on that, and pushing on that. And the ultimate thing was he was balanced in the end. All his efforts that he did in that direction eventually were balanced by whatever it took to balance that. Mm-hmm. And what's left is the waste of all that. Mm-hmm. Because the appropriateness of the Aryan, non-Aryan part, this thing that he was pushing for was not appropriate to life. Right. So these things that we want to make happen with good intentions ultimately fail because the opposite of that is also present. At the same time, we're pushing in that direction. The more I want to be the perfect human being, the more imperfect I become. So it's just something you have to recognize. I mean, life is like, you can look at anything like the surface of life and then what's underneath the surface. So you look at people and they say on the surface, everything is just fine. You can see that they create that. A lot of times, how are you doing? Everything's fine. Mm-hmm. So underneath the surface, though, it's, the opposite of that. There's things that are going on that they don't want to talk about, that they never talk about. And because of that, they're out of communication with each other in honest ways. And they're basically, again, more and more separate, even within the same marriage, the same household and everything else. So you could look at it like this, but then underneath it all, you see there's something like this. To the degree you can get underneath it all and recognize all this is the degree that actually you can shift all that. But just coming up with this, everything is nice, everything is fine thing, really just is it's just concealing everything else that isn't that.
Well, I think about, when you say that, I think about the ocean. You look at the ocean and it just looks like, it looks like what's on the surface. And then underneath is this whole other world that we
Yeah, the
don't
ocean's
see.
underneath, it's not on the surface.
Right.
So life is really what's underneath. It's not something that's just, we're trying to act a certain way.
Right. Yeah. Well, one of the points I wrote down, which you just elaborated on a little bit, the opposites that we look through distinguish who we are and determine our experience of life. So, if the first most fundamental way that we look at human being is individual, male and females, that's what we get. We get a world where we're separate, where life is over here and we're over there, or we're over here and life is over there. And but if we look at human beings as a generational balance of expanding and contracting energy, then we're part of life. We're part of the whole. This is the difference that makes the difference. It brings us all together, and all our other differences separate us into smaller and smaller groups.
Yeah, so if I'm an individual separate from what's around me, I mean, it's kind of like I don't have any power, right? Everything is bigger than me. Mm-hmm. And I'm scared of what could happen to me. I'm at the effect of life. Life is over there, and I'm scared of what might happen to me. You know what I mean? Like this person over here, and everything else is around me and bigger than me, and I don't know how I'm even supposed to fit into this thing. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So that way of looking at ourselves is basically self-destructive, because that's not who we are. But because our minds have that picture of ourselves like that, we experience this. And in that kind of a world, you're in survival, which means trying to take what you need to survive. So you're taking something at the same time you're losing something. So it's basically a lose-lose situation. The people you're taking it from, or the world that you're taking it from, the earth that you're taking it from is losing, and you're also losing. It's like doing opposite, right? You go like this, and then something happens like this. And there's no way out of it. Coming from being separate from life, that's exactly what's going on. So to reverse that, you got to have distinction for something more than us being male, female individuals, which is the surface stuff, Underneath the surface, no, there's energy here, and there's a balance of energy that's necessary for life to exist, and it exists in us, and it actually occurs generationally. That's what's going on underneath. If you can understand all of this, then the surface actually can be appropriate to life. But right now, it's just inappropriate, what we're seeing.
Well, yeah, the thing about that this distinction brings us together, that all other differences separate us into smaller and smaller groups. I mean,
everything breaks down more and more and more because there's nothing to hold it together. The foundational principle of who we are as human beings, the distinction for the being of human being, is not present. So therefore, whatever we come up with to distinguish who we are ultimately fails. It's not appropriate.
Like cultural differences, racial differences, religious differences.
As the fundamental thing. In other words, you could actually say that I'm a fisherman and have that be the fundamental thing in your life. Mm-hmm. This is who I am. Everybody else is not a fisherman. I have nothing to do with them, and whole life's about fishing. And and if I don't catch the fish, my life is ruined. So it comes down to things like that people are living their lives for.
Well, it's like here we talk about when we see that human being is designed to balance one another in the family, one generation to the next, we all have a common denominator. We're all part of life as life for life. We each have our designated way of contributing, and then we can celebrate our differences, which is true.
Yeah, I had no connection. Up till, like I said, 31 years ago, I had no connection to life. I cared. I did everything I could do from here. I gave people what I could give them. I tried to give them the best I could with fresh food and things like that. But ultimately, my mind had me disconnected from what was around me. I was too scared to talk to people. You brought a person to me, I'd be shy. I'd kind of back away. I didn't know how to even express myself, in a social setting. So, to speak to people was very difficult for me. So, this thing that became clear to me, that that there's a generational difference that describes who we are, changed me, because no longer was I this individual thing separate from everything around me. I was actually part of something, and I started recognizing this is the part that I am and this is the part that I'm not. And the more that I could recognize that difference, the more I came together. The separation wasn't there. So recognizing the distinction, expanding, contracting, this fundamental difference that exists generationally on the male line and the female line, allowed me to connect. It's kind of, the dual and opposite thing. The more I could see us distinctly different, the more connected I became, you know what I mean, to you and to life in general. The more I could see that difference. So that's another way of looking at it. The more I could recognize the difference, the more I could see the connectedness of who we are.
Right. Well, it's like, if we have this as the lowest common denominator, it doesn't matter what religion you are or what culture you are or.
Yeah, that's like on the surface of stuff. I mean, it's like a diversity thing. Mm-hmm. It's like the plants. I mean, they have all kinds of varieties of plants. We can celebrate plants. We can celebrate birds. There's all this variety and beauty, in that. And the human cultures are like that too, yeah. If you look at all that. But the problem is these cultures, which are beautiful and everything else, are undermined because we're essentially at odds with ourselves. Mm-hmm. Life is over there and we're at war with it. Mm-hmm. It's going to happen to me. I'm at the effect of it. I need to protect myself. I need to buy insurance. I need my government to protect me. I need whatever I need, to protect me from what might happen. Instead of looking at it like, well, it's just a reflection of who you're being. Right. There's nothing to be afraid of. It's just, what is, I'm the producer, director, and actor in this movie that I'm creating over here. I need to be responsible for that. Why should I be afraid of it? It's just simply just a reflection of who I'm being.
Right. Okay, so we've been talking about duality, and Robert, you had a couple of personal experiences that you wanted to share about that.
Okay, I also want to explain a couple personal dual and opposite things. Like I had built my market, as a greenhouse structure because I had very little money when I started, and it was done by myself and some other people very inexpensively. And after about a year and a half, we expanded it to twice the size. And at one point there in the winter, we actually had an ice storm that crushed the roof of it. It turned out that it was a very kind of severe thing where the ice accumulated in the gutters and there was a weak point and it eventually flattened the whole thing. So I lost the building and I lost the product that was underneath in there and the equipment to a great degree so that I couldn't really reopen anymore. And I just spent whatever money I had on expanding it. So to me, it looked like, on the surface again, you know what I mean? It looked like, why is this happening to me, I had done everything I could do for the community to get started, and it was very difficult. A lot of people were just anti-everything. So it took us a while to get established, and when we were established, things were moving along and we were doing okay. And I asked for the insurance company to pay, some sort of thing as far as my damages were concerned. And all they had to say was, we don't insure ice storms. So I had nothing from the insurance companies. So to me, it was like I was looking up, and wondering why did this happen to me? Why did this happen to me? And then, out of nowhere, these guys came out of the neighborhood. I don't even know who these people were. There was I must have been about 30 guys came out of the neighborhood, and they basically shoveled off the ice off the top of this thing, tore the roof off the thing, and exposed whatever was left underneath. And it was like drizzly, cold rain, everything else. And I was trying to sell stuff, to cars that were coming by. My customers were, used to being there on a Sunday. This is like on a Saturday night. And I was trying to sell whatever I could sell that way. So to me, it looked like I've lost it all, really, But then, again, the surface. But then what was underneath the surface was my customers. It's hard to even talk about it. But anyways, they supported me. They wanted to know what they could do to support the market. And I told them, we didn't have the money to rebuild. And they literally gave me the money to rebuild. They gave me checks, with contributions to rebuild the place. And, I got enough money to put up a metal building, and we did it in 10 weeks. And then I told them, I just didn't want to take your money. I want to make sure that you can get something for your money, So I told them, just keep track. Anybody that comes to shop, once we reopened, could use that canceled check for food, and I just keep a record on the back of your canceled check until it was used up. when you came to buy food, and that's what I did for a lot of the customers, but many didn't even do that. They just gave me the money. So that's an example of.
But you also built even a better place.
Yeah, I mean, it gave us the room to grow. So you look back at it and said, well, why did this happen to me? Well, number one, I couldn't have grown with the building that I had. Mm-hmm. I couldn't really air condition it or anything else. It had to be a metal building of some sort that I could actually condition properly. Mm-hmm. And it gave me the room to grow over the next 8 or 9 years, that structure. We added some refrigeration in the back, which we didn't have before, so we could actually turn it into something that could sustain some sort of fresh business, over the years. Mm-hmm. And so it was a breakthrough, really. Yeah. And this tremendous breakdown. But it also connected me, my customers, in a way that it's never, it's always been there for me. Right. Because when I went to build the second market on a large piece of property, because that property was only 2 acres, it was rented at the beginning. I purchased it, and then we were always hemmed in there, with cars and traffic. It was very hard to do business there. And but we were very busy, and eventually I got this land and I built this building that we're in today. And but I never wanted to go far away from my customers, right. Never like into these newer areas. Right. Yeah. So I found this piece of land. I was able to develop that land and move over there, and that's where we are today. So that's an example of something showing up in your life that, God, why is this happening to me? And then when you look a little deeper into it, you realize that the blessing is there. Whatever was going on that you couldn't understand was really a blessing. And I remember some other stuff, like one time I was doing this course with you. That's how we met there. It's kind of like an outward bound course of sorts, where you test your limits as far as, what limits you in your life, so to speak, So I was on this rappel thing. Other people were doing it, and I was watching them do it. But when my turn came, and the guy told me, okay, I want you to take this rope and wrap it around this hook. And I think it was like a wrap and a half or something like that. I looked at this, said, and now you just need to, kick yourself off to the side and use the rope and just, feed it, and then you'll go down. You know what I mean? But when I was looking at it, I said, I don't think that's going to hold me. I didn't think that wrap, around this hook was going to give enough, friction or something to hold me. And I just got scared, And it was like, I felt like I was going to die. Right. So on the surface here, again, I'm thinking this is the end. You know what I mean? If I listen to this guy. And he was screaming at me at some point there because he knew better than me that if I would just follow what he told me, I'd be fine. But I was like locked into my mind, and I was thinking, whatever I was thinking, and it was basically that I couldn't do this. You know what I mean? So at some point, I don't know, I must have been there for 5 minutes or something before I finally, I don't even know if it was 5. It seemed like it was a long time.
I think it was more like 20. I was next in line.
Well, a long time trying to make up my mind what to do here, and whether to trust this guy or not. And then, but I had been so separate, like I told you before, in my mind, everything was over there. I'm over here, and my mind is in control. And, and it's trying to protect me from what's going on out there. And this is another thing that's going to hurt me. And I didn't know how to deal with it. You know what I mean? Because my mind was like totally locked into this thing, like in survival, Right. And then finally, I let the words in. Whatever the guy was telling me, he was screaming at me. I finally just said, okay, I'll do it. And I just finally figured I was going to die, finally started going down this thing, little by little, like he told me to. And I remember the guy was looking at me, and he says, just be miserable all the way down, just be miserable all the way to the bottom. But what actually occurred was when I hit bottom was that there was a crack in the system. My mind had it this way. And then when I got down to the bottom, it wasn't that way at all. And for the first time in my life, my mind lost its grip on me. So essentially, instead of dying, which I was thinking was going to happen at the top, I actually came alive for the first time. I remember looking at trees and plants and flowers and the brilliance of the colors. I couldn't believe it. It was like all of a sudden this thing opened up for me. I was no longer like locked into this isolation chamber. I was actually free for that particular moment. You know what I mean? When I hit bottom there. And then it just continued, like this opening just kind of like was there, you know, for the rest of my life. It never really closed down like it was before.
Right.
So there's an example of like where you think this is going to kill you, and ultimately you can see life is supporting you to grow and develop. So I have that awareness now that things that I think are the worst things that could possibly happen ultimately turn out to be, you know, the best things that could happen. Another example of that is with my father, you know, not getting along with him and having to leave basically to do my own business. And at the time, that was the worst thing that could happen. My father, you know, trusting other people more than me, and after what I was doing, and he was accusing me of stuff that wasn't right at all. When somebody else was taking advantage of him, he would accuse me, well, he wouldn't do it to me. You must have been taking advantage of him or something. So it was this thing about, you know, just not trusting and not really being the way you wanted to be with your father, no matter how hard I had tried, all the way up to 28 years old, since a 6-year-old, you know, going to work with him. So I was at this situation where, you know, my father was a huge disappointment, my relationship with my father. And I basically had to go and sell this little house that I had and try to do something on my own. He didn't give me anything to start with, you know, restart anything other than this little house that I had that he'd give me the down payment for. So I managed to get $30,000 out of the sale of the house, and it took me almost 9 months to sell it. And I was, you know, doing what I could do to survive during that period of time. And then finally moved to Atlanta after figuring out that that would be a better place than, say, Florida or something like that for business, and started this market up with $30,000 basically. So, but later on, you know what I mean, my father came down to see me after a while. You know, it's like, it wasn't like we were worst enemies. It was just like we never could get along. But eventually my father came down to see the market, you know, and he was so proud of what I had done. I had a house right across the parking lot from the old market. He used to go over there and cook lunch for everybody. Mm-hmm. You know, he was a great guy, my father, you know, in that way. He loved people. And he even got to see the new building. He came into the new building. Mm-hmm. And ultimately he introduced me to someone who told me about these programs that I was talking to you about, where I met you. My father introduced me to somebody like that. So here's my father, you know, and me fighting, you know. And in the end, what I got out of that was a whole new world, you know what I mean, that I began to start that he could appreciate. And it was more like what I really wanted to make happen. My father told me, you're not going to do more than one market. That's it. You could do the discount store business because we were right at the very beginning of it. You could have done a lot of stores, you know, because you had the background in it, and you could have done that. But I told him I didn't want to just do that. I really wanted to sell something I thought was most important. But he told me, you know, you're going to have to do this one place. And he was right. To make that market what it really needed to be, I needed to focus on that, not make a chain of situations. So ultimately, I had this dream too, when I was 22, about wanting to understand people and work with people properly. And I couldn't make that happen at that point in time. But when the break came between me and my father, and I eventually got to Atlanta and built whatever I could get started doing down here and got something going, you know, the whole thing shifted, you know, where my father could appreciate me in a way he couldn't before. I could appreciate him in a way that I couldn't before. And my dream ultimately for people to get along and to figure out what would make the difference to that was something that occurred, you know, as time went on. So on the surface, my father and I not getting along and breaking up and not being able to deal with each other the way I really had in my heart to do, you know, didn't work. But something else worked, you know, that was important to me and to him to see. You know, he was very proud of me that we had done what we'd done down here. So these are things that, you know, you could look at in terms of duality. Mm-hmm. You got this, but you also got that, you know. So, you know, you get married and you think that it's going to be all love and everything, right? Well, the first thing that shows up when you're thinking like that is the opposite. You know, we're in conflict already. You know, she's angry at me about this or that. But if you know going into it that, okay, you know, you're going to experience love, but you're also going to experience the opposite of that. Some of the strong emotion that makes you feel like you want to quit, you know. They come together. You don't get one without the other. Yeah. The more you're looking for just one, the more you're never going to get it, because you're always going to get one and the other. They come in packages, you know. Mm-hmm. So that's what I mean by duality. You don't get one without the other. So marriage is a real challenge, because there's high times and like moments of joy, and there's moments of the exact opposite, of frustration and anger and everything else. You know what I mean? It's all a process of growing and developing. After you got that anger, you realize, well, this is what was going on. I started to own maybe more about what was going on with me out of that process, So it's not just being angry at you, it's like being able to recognize more about what's going on with me. That's what that's about, So when you go into marriage, you can start looking at it like that too, that it is a dual and opposite experience, There's no and the same way with raising kids, you want your kid to be perfect. Well, the first thing that's going to show up is them not being perfect at all. So the more you can accept them to be non-perfect, is the degree that he can grow and develop. The more perfect you want him to be, the more you're going to experience the opposite of that. This kid gets angry and upset and everything else all the time. So the degree I can grant being to one is to the degree that I can experience the other. The degree I can grant being to the fact that we're going to get pissed with each other is the degree that we can actually love each other. It's just, you've got to grant being to both. You don't get one without the other. That's the freedom thing, that we're talking about. In any program, like I said, with the government, like Social Security, that's a great one, where they're going to take care of you. We're going to take care of you. Well, I call it social insecurity because now the Social Security system is basically heading towards bankruptcy. It doesn't have the funds to keep it going. So when the government says, we're going to give you this, just remember, you get that and you also get the opposite. Like the Affordable Care Act with this healthcare thing. It's supposed to be the Affordable Care Act. When you look at the label that they give it, all you got to look at is the opposite of that, all right? Less affordable, less available. It's supposed to be affordable, more available, the exact opposite. More expensive and less options, That's what's going to happen. You can't get one without the other. So you got to be very careful. You start a war, well, what's going to happen is, that war is going to be, whatever you start, you're going to get the opposite of that. When we go into war, we're going to get the opposite. What about Vietnam? We went to war in Vietnam. It wasn't like Vietnam came over here to start a war. We went over there and started a war in Vietnam. And in the end, we were kicked out of Vietnam because, the more we went this way and the more we wanted to go that way, the more the opposite shows up. And you never win a war you start.
Well, and then what it did to the country, too.
It's the ultimate...
It demoralized.
It's the ultimate waste. The idea of thinking that you can have it your way. Life is going to balance that. Whatever you put out, you get balance. Balance is the key thing. You don't get one without the other. Balance makes the difference. And we got to get used to that idea. That, that what we're dealing with is dual and opposite. It's not individual. No matter how much money and power you think you have, you can't force things to happen. Ultimately, the opposite will show up.
Right. Well, let me just end this with some of the quotes that you put at the end of your book. You wrote, the generation... Or the end of the chapter, yeah. The generational distinction is the anti-venom to the poisonous bite of the myth of the individual. That's a good one.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
the generational distinction is the anti-venom to the poisonous bite of the myth of the individual.
Right.
It's true.
Yeah, and you say human being has never been distinguished appropriately before. As a result, we've created scarcity and suffering. And now that we have the appropriate opposites to see ourselves, appropriate to life, it is expanding space-creating energy and contracting time-creating energy. It's the generational distinction.
Yeah, it's like the foundation is solid when you have this place to come from.
One thing I just want to say about the generational distinction, and you talked about Daniel or having your children. Watching Daniel grow up from the time he was 2 years old, so many times I thought how lucky he is that you had this distinction because, you have big shoes to fill. And if Daniel was always trying to be like you, it would have been a very, very difficult life for him. And as a result of your allowing him to be just who he was, he's grown up. He has a lot of confidence. Your relationship with Daniel is really great. The way you work together. And I just know it made the difference.
Yeah. It's given him the opportunity to be who he can be, without me wanting to be different than he is. Mm-hmm. It's a blessing for both of us to have this distinction.
Right.
Fathers and sons have a tough time with each other. One wanting the other one to be the way they expect them to be.
Well, I think fathers always want their sons to be like them.
Yeah, essentially. And that's a trap.
Yeah. Because
they're fundamentally not. The father is the middleman between the grandfather and the grandson. So it's not like the father should be like the son, or the son should be like the father. It's more like, look here, appreciate who your father was, and then you can appreciate who your son is. So the degree I can appreciate my father, and the difference between us is the degree that I can allow my son, which is really his replacement, to be all that he can be. I'm the middleman between those two.
Right.
The contracting father, expanding son, and then the contracting grandson. The grandson's my father's replacement. And like what happened when he was about to die, my father, right? You were there. You want to say what happened?
Yeah, we were there in California. Daniel was 3 years old, and I think he knew that we weren't going to see him again. And when we were leaving, he looked at Daniel and said, "You take good care of your daddy."
Yeah. It was like my father was passing the torch to his grandson, to take care of me. Right. I mean, basically to do the job that he was doing, looking after me. It was an amazing statement.
Yeah, it was.
It was an amazing statement. And at the time, I didn't have this distinction. And I keep saying to myself, all these years, that even if my father never could let this one in or even understand it, I know that understanding the difference on my own would have changed my behavior towards my father 180 degrees. Yeah. I mean, because I understood that my father was this other type of person, you know what I mean? I could have gotten along with him in a way never possible before, no matter what he understood about it, because he's a reflection of me. I'm the expanding guy. He's a reflection of who I'm being. If who I was really appreciative of him and understanding of him in a way that I can do today, back then, he would have been a different guy, And in a way, I just pray for him to realize it.
Well, my mother, who was expanding, she had a hard time with her mother. And I understood her mother. And I used to say to her, Mom, do this for Grandma, or don't do that. Or Grandma doesn't like it when you do that. Do this, I understood her, but it was just innate, And like she would buy her something that I'd say, Mom, she's not going to like that. I would know what and I said, buy her these. And she'd buy them, and then my grandmother would like them, because what my mother necessarily liked, my grandmother didn't like, but I understood my grandmother. So it's definitely.
I never met my grandfather. He died on December 25th, the year I was born. So, but what I heard about my grandfather through my mother was that he was a very honorable guy. He came to this country and had 6 children and built a business for himself. Didn't know the language, didn't really know much about math or anything like that. He could do figures in his head. So he built this business of basically recycling bags. You'd go to grocery stores, get the empty bags, clean them and recycle them and sell them back to the people that were filling them up with stuff. It's like a burlap bag, cotton bag recycling business. And he had a good reputation in the way he treated people. He also had a good reputation in terms of being loyal to his family. And I remember my father telling you that.
Yeah.
What did my father tell you?
Well, he said, that you were very hard to understand. And if I could figure you out, you would be a loyal husband. That much he knew.
So my father had a tough time with me, right?
Yeah.
I couldn't speak to him in a way that he could understand me,
Right.
And because I didn't have these distinctions. So, I'm living my life so that maybe others can see and benefit from, what we've recognized in their relationships with their parents and spouses and children, right? That's what this is about.